Australian manufacturers should consider sending jobs offshore to keep their businesses viable in the so-called Asian century. That's the advice of former Secretary of the Treasury, Ken Henry. And while that might be political poison, Dr Henry says it's one way of dealing with the persistently high Australian dollar. Neil Woolridge reports.
Blundstone boots may not be the most fashionable accessory Australia has produced, but Blundstone's decision in 2005 to move much of its manufacturing offshore is part of a growing trend, and the former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry says it's a fashion other local firms should follow.
Instead of making the same products that they were making 140 years ago, that capacity can instead be used to make and do things that only we can, or that Australia can do better than people in other countries.
Dr Henry told the Australian Industry Group's National Forum that sending jobs overseas is easier said than done, not least because of the likely backlash. And while he expects the Australian dollar will remain high for the foreseeable future, Dr Henry says keeping in place politically difficult reforms like the floating exchange rate and competition policy will be critical in the so-called Asian century.
These things have helped protect Australia from the impact of several economic shocks emanating from overseas. It's important that we build on them and that we resist the temptation to dismantle parts of the framework, even though we may perceive in that dismantling a short-term advantage.
In the United States, though, the offshoring trend may be reversing, with some firms considering whether to bring production back home.
We see our companies really reevaluating the businesses that they own, and are they the right businesses to serve their customers tomorrow? There's a lot of people really looking over that horizon to try to get their business model right for where their customers are going to need them 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years from now.
Tim Hanley says global manufacturing could be in the midst of a renaissance with the rise of new methods like additive manufacturing and nanotechnology. And he says that could provide opportunities for developed economies in manufacturing, even though emerging nations like Vietnam and Thailand are replacing China as the world's cheapest manufacturers.
What this tells developed economies like mine and like yours is that the competition is going to be tough. And so it's even more important to focus ahead on some of these advanced manufacturing capabilities, because it's only going to be tougher competing out there in the years to come.
Australia's manufacturing industry is going through a painful transition from being low or medium cost to now becoming a high-cost producer. Professor Goran Roos says Australia should aim to emulate Sweden, where nearly half of its exports are priced 30% or more higher than equivalent items made in lower-cost countries.
We can't compete on cost. Forget it. It's impossible, right? So we have to compete on value for money.
And food and agriculture is the best long-run bet you could have in Australia, because there's no water, bad soil, and lots of people who want better food in Asia. Australia is incredibly well placed for that.
As the $2.5 billion Mars Explorer Curiosity demonstrates, the United States remains the engine room of global innovation. Jeffrey Garrett says that will help the US remain an economic power in the years ahead. Australia, however, remains a long way behind on that score, and improving innovation will be the key to whether the local industry crashes and burns or enjoys a textbook soft landing.